You present the appearance of a man with a problem.
Your perception is correct, Doctor. In order to return us to the exact moment we left the 23rd century, I have used our journey back through time as a referent, calculating the coefficient of elapsed time in relation to the acceleration curve.
Naturally.
Acceleration is no longer a constant.
Yes, Spock.
Guessing is not in my nature, Doctor.
Well.
Hello and welcome. Here's a quote from Bertrand Russell. The whole problem with the world is that fools and fanatics are always so certain of themselves, but wiser people so full of doubts. What do we do about this? We can take some basic logic to this, and we can see, well, the fix is not to make wiser people more certain of themselves. Well, why? Well, because the statement is, if wise, then uncertain, even though it might be easy to misread it as, if uncertain, then wise. So, we have our two valid and two invalid things that we can do with the if-then statement, if wise, then uncertain. You can A the A and D the C, but you can't D the A or A the C. So the valid things that we're allowed to do with this if-then statement, wise, therefore uncertain, affirm the antecedent. Wiser people are full of doubts. This is precisely what Russell is saying. The other valid thing we're allowed to do with this, not uncertain, therefore unwise. So denying the consequent. If the person is certain, they must not be wise, since wise people are uncertain. So what invalid things are we allowed to do with this if-then statement, which is if wise, then uncertain? Not wise, therefore not uncertain. So denying the antecedent. It's fairly obvious that Russell is not saying in the quote that unwise people are necessarily certain. Although that this would be what he's saying if we take the rest of the quote and we assume that he is saying that all people are either fools / fanatics or wise, but I don't think that that could be read into the quote. Anyway, the other invalid move in interpreting the if-then statement, if wise then uncertain, would be uncertain, therefore wise, affirming the consequent. And this would be the tempting one. This would be the error that we might want to make, uncertain, therefore wise. So this last invalid move is the one that undergraduates tend to make when they think they can become wise by rejecting knowledge and perspectives rather than by understanding them, or by only understanding that some people might find things wrong with them. So uncertainty might be in demand somewhere, but this does not make it wisdom. And wiser people are uncertain, but this does not make uncertain people necessarily wise. But this is, of course, just a review of the logic that we've already covered. The quote above introduces the third act of the course because what remains is how to deal with uncertainty. So we're now wise beyond our years in terms of knowing how our understanding can be flawed and how our reasoning can be scientifically deployed to guard effectively against these flaws. If wise, and we are now wise, if wise, then uncertain. So, we now need to figure out how to manage our uncertainty and engage in wise judgment. First task, epistemology refers to our theory of how we know things. As we grow as an individual or as a society, our epistemology becomes increasingly concerned with distinguishing well-justified beliefs, or what some pithily call facts, from less supported or unsupported beliefs, or what we might call opinions. This growth is generally called development, which is change and refinement, usually positive change and refinement, though not necessarily, as time and experience increase. Note that the apotheosis, or the highest point of this development process, is not necessarily rejecting all unsupported beliefs or only accepting supported ones. We don't get to find support for a lot of the things that we have to make decisions about. What we do with our increasingly developed epistemology is still up to us, and how we morally judge the goodness or badness of epistemology and the changes that we make is still up to us. In other words, the development of our epistemology is not towards any given conclusion, but towards different or better approaches, standards, or processes. Note also that when we are talking about human development, this tends to mean the addition of skills, strategies, or abilities, not the wholesale replacement of previous ones with newer ones. Some notes on the development of our epistemology. First, the warrant or the justification for calling the change in epistemology development. We call it development because the change or growth we observe helps us to better interact with the world. All three of the major philosophical forces in psychology, psychodynamic, behaviorist, and humanist, and any of the biological approaches which would follow evolutionary theory, have observed that the health or well-being of the individual is a function of the accuracy of one's representation of reality. For the psychodynamicists, your pathology is a function of how much or how often, in order to avoid anxiety, your ego defense mechanisms tend to distort reality. For behaviorists, effective behavior is that which is rewarded by the environment, so to survive, one should be wired, firstly, to be rewarded for actions that help survival, secondly, to discriminate behaviors that are effective from those that are not, and thirdly, to change or to extinguish our behavior when the environment or the rewards change. So to do any of this, one needs to consistently identify and differentiate aspects of reality, as reality is what things and rewards are made of. For humanists, especially Rogerian person-centered therapists, the idea of your own personal growth being a function of accuracy is called correspondence. In order to grow to our natural potential, we need to be able to see and understand in our own terms how our idea of ourself corresponds or does not correspond to how we actually act in the world. We will naturally work to narrow the gap between our idea of ourselves and the reality of ourselves. And this happens just if we're simply allowed to clearly see the unpleasant lack of correspondence. Humanistic therapists generally are non-directive, meaning that they leave this process up to the client, whereas more popular cognitive behavioral therapies work to confront inaccurate and unhelpful thinking more directly or efficiently. The third wave CBT approaches like acceptance and commitment therapy, which gets people to accept their condition, warts and all, and dialectical behavioral therapy, which shows clients the range of their self-contradictions, especially their emotional self-contradictions, in the hopes that clients can put together a coherent reality-based center. So we've added CBT along with psychodynamic behaviors and humanist approaches because the idea is the same, to align thoughts with what would work in reality. The biological approaches similarly see things like perceptual systems and their resultant behaviors or beliefs. If these perceptual systems don't lead to effective actions, then they are essentially evolutionarily wrong, in the sense that if one does not survive to procreate and have offspring that also survive to procreate, then one's genes die out. So in other words, your eyes or ears and your brain have failed to keep your genes alive if they did not respond to reality in a way that makes you reproduce. So this doesn't mean that survival or survival promoting actions are morally good, just that those are the mechanisms that surviving organisms have evolved in order to be here and will continue to have for eons if they survive, whether we like these mechanisms or not, and whether we bother to understand or acknowledge them or not. Now, across all of these models, moving one's individual epistemology, one's individual theory of how one knows, from simply seeing or hearing and accepting toward distinguishing the strength or accuracy of one's knowledge is developing insight, reality testing. For psychodynamicists, it is developing a more mature personality with less use of what they call primal or even psychotic defense mechanisms, which just means ones that are developmentally younger, ones you might have used as a baby or an infant or a toddler that don't look great if you use them as an adult. For behaviorists, it is discriminating between and generalizing across that which rewards and that which does not. For humanists, developing is having a self-concept that corresponds with reality, so one can self-actualize one's truest desires. For CBT, it's having effective beliefs, usually less negative ones, to better act in the world. And for biological approaches, development is aligning behavior with effective survival, mating, investment in offspring. So the idea here is more accurate views of the world are more developed and healthier views of the world. So I could mention two exceptions, at least here, to the more accurate is more developed idea. Two non-signatories to the more accurate is more developed notion. One being any theory that supports the idea of a golden lie or a noble lie. So in other words, some approaches, and only some approaches, believe that some knowledge could be dangerous, discomforting, or misinterpreted. So it is the responsibility of those who know these facts to hide them from others. In psychology, this has been the case, for example, with a limited set of feminist approaches that simultaneously attempted to argue away or censor observations of sex differences, and misinform textbook readers about the findings and actual approaches of evolutionary and biopsychology generally. Another example would be Viktor Frankl's logotherapy, which assumes, or at least one aspect of it, assumes that we should overestimate the positive potential of individuals and of society in general in order to effect the most positive change possible. These examples are just to show that there are exceptions in psychology to the more accurate is more healthy or well idea, but the idea is central to nearly every perspective that has cared about improving thought, emotion, and behavior. A second note on the development of our epistemology, underlying this notion that accuracy regarding reality is both objectively and subjectively good for people is a notion that sometimes could be used to argue its opposite, as might be the case with Viktor Frankl's logotherapy. Pragmatism argues that reason arrives at truth by testing the efficacy of one's actions. Sounds pretty good. More deeply, for something to be meaningful and therefore have a chance of being true, it would have to be capable of being put into practice. And that practice should be somewhat successful in order to convince us to keep accepting something as truth. This is the deeper substrate of Dr. Phil's deep-cutting question, how's that working for you? In part, this is an effective question because it shows that something that likely it was working at one point, maybe venting frustrations by bullying other people, which can feel good in the moment, is now not working or backfiring. So if someone is coming to see you for counseling or consultation, then something is indeed not working, which makes this a handy go-to question when one finds one's clients or oneself resisting change or rationalizing prior behavior, i.e. looking at one's behaviors or thoughts only through the default self-magnifying lens of confirmation bias. Sticking with Dr. Phil, his self-help model is pretty much 3 questions. What are you doing that is working, which is important to start with to get people observing their life and seeing examples of things that work. 2, what do you need to stop doing that's getting in the way of what you want? 3, what do you need to start doing to get what you want? This is pragmatism, or at least the most shallow form of it. Essentially, you need to cycle through the System 2 reasoning process a few more times to update your knowledge so that your behaviors change. Dr. Phil also has a rule, deal only with the truth, which should serve to confirm his place amongst the more accurate is more healthy and well crowd. Before we get to the deeper form of pragmatism, which is far more interesting and less commonsensical, we should look at the steps involved in cycling through the reasoning process. So for Charles Sanders Peirce, pictured on the left, reasoning has 3 parts. Basically everything had 3 parts for Charles Sanders Peirce. He loved trichotomies. Nearly everything in his philosophy has 3 parts. So reasoning has 3 parts: abduction, deduction, and induction. We start with the knowledge soup, the little pot there, the quasi-organized mass of what we know. And from it, we hypothesize. And that's the definition of abduction, is just the process of hypothesizing. His earlier work, he called it hypothesis, and then he realized that's a little confusing because it was actually the process of hypothesizing, so then he called it abduction. Please note, because it's a cool image that I'll unpack a bit, but this image is just the tiny corner of Peirce's work that is his 3 parts of reasoning. All the other concepts are absent from this. So let's run through a quick case using our Dr. Phil example, the person who is bullying others. So let's say Karen has the idea that she is better than her younger sibling, Susan. So there's plenty of observation over the course of their lives that would support the induction of this rule, especially since Karen's the older sibling. She would have been ahead of Susan for much of their lives. Moreover, let's assume that Karen finds a superiority over Susan to be meaningful to her self-concept. So it's something that comes up in her thinking from time to time. More specifically, recalling this rule makes Karen feel better about herself. So Karen has a rule then: I am, or I must be, better than Susan. Following this rule, any result observed should be that Karen on task X does better than Susan. And any cases of task X we observe should see Karen as being better than Susan. When this induced rule and its corresponding abducted hypotheses are transformed into deductions, they read as Karen is always better than Susan. So this is our universal affirmative in the deductive statement. The next premise would be X is something that Susan has just done, for example. So a case of task X. And the prediction, before we see how Susan has done would be, therefore Susan will not have done X as well as Karen. To keep this deduction from being falsified, Karen's imperfect human brain can be overly critical of Susan. She could inflate Karen's own ability, or otherwise, make excuses or seek exceptions. The bullying, because that was the problem, Karen was bullying Susan. The bullying might come from Karen being overly critical in this case. Maybe that criticism has actually worked in the past. So maybe when they were younger, when Susan tried something and showed promise, Karen would discourage Susan from doing it again, thus preventing Susan from getting better, so that she was never better than Karen at anything. Karen could also fail to falsify her deduction that she made. So let's say we're in the reality where Susan is actually doing something better than Karen. Karen could fail to falsify the deduction by using the magnifying glass, right? By magnifying her own preconceptions to distract herself from learning about this new bit of reality. So maybe Karen starts listing all the things that Karen is good at, saying something like, well, Susan just did X pretty well, but Susan is the person who failed at Y and Z, and well, I did a great job on Y and Z with very little effort, but she did poorly on them. So she's distracting her brain from being able to learn from the world about X by magnifying her thoughts, her own preconceptions, which by reiterating the things that she's better at than Karen instead. Despite what Karen might do to prevent herself from learning, both Dr. Phil and Charles Pierce believe that the world resists error. In other words, as long as Karen keeps looking, she will eventually be forced by reality to concede that her belief in her own superiority over Susan is not working as an effective belief. Maybe it worked in the past because it was either correct or led Karen to effectively sabotage Susan, but as long as Susan outperforms Karen in something, Karen's incorrect belief will be chipped away at until it is amended. And it is this amendment process, usually, that's the task of therapies. Who am I, and what is my value if I'm not better than Susan? It's this deeper level of pragmatism that's getting more popular in things like addictions treatment. So why would a fruit fly, deprived of mating, start drinking too much alcohol? It is refused satisfaction in one place, and so it seeks it in another. Why might Karen start drinking? Because Susan's success removes part of how Karen got her satisfaction. At this point, Karen needs some new actions from which she can induce that satisfaction. And alcohol or other drugs are often effective counterfeit forms of satisfaction. Depth psychology would attempt to tease out why Karen gets meaning or fulfillment from Susan's failures, while most other approaches would start with substituting the deductions. So, for example, correcting the belief I need a drink, or behaviors, so punishing drinking with antabuse, or rewarding some substitute behavior. Exercise would be ideal. And then the psychodynamicists might call the complex. The complex that Karen has could work itself out as she learns via induction conclusions from observing herself that other things besides alcohol or besides her comparison with herself and Susan can fulfill whatever need she had. This is pragmatism. We will and do believe what works, but as the philosopher Pierce pointed out, it is what works according to what is meaningful to us. Karen has a need addressed by her either through bullying Susan or drinking alcohol, and the need comes from having found meaning in being better than Susan, or a substitute satisfaction from the depressant effects of alcohol. It may be the case that in order to help Karen, or to help relapsing individuals with addictions, we need to address this void of meaning. This is one of the reasons why research into single treatment hallucinogen sessions for addictions has returned since going away after a brief stint in the 60s. It may be that the quickest way to find whatever profundity one's specific life is lacking. For example, what question was Karen is always better than Susan answering? What challenge is I just need a drink distracting us from? What insecurities are our justifications for procrastination preventing us from encountering? The point here is that this is all actually baked into the philosophy of pragmatism. That which can be put into practice and found to be effective is true. So, by aligning ourselves to reality, we are not just making ourselves better adapted to the world, we are also putting truth into the world through our actions, truth that is aligned with what we find meaningful. Before you conclude that that sounds hokey, consider the example. If Karen induces that all volunteers seem to have meaning in their lives, then abductively she hypothesizes that volunteering with Meals on Wheels would bring her satisfaction. Her consequent deduction, volunteering brings me satisfaction, could lead to many actions and observations that do not just change her own knowledge, but the observable knowledge of others. And if her deduction is correct, and this is observable by others, she is influencing the truth, or at least knowledge of it, in the direction of her belief, because it leads to action and is effective. So in other words, people see her being fulfilled and having satisfaction, and that makes not just her own knowledge of volunteering leading to satisfaction more true, but also potentially other people's knowledge of this fact more true as well. Of course, the flip side here is that she could also turn out to hate volunteering and thus contribute to falsifying her induced rule that all volunteers have meaning in their lives. Either way, pragmatism cares about what you put into the world and how it helps to make the truth. And it does this without falling into either naive realism or subjectivism or relativism. More on that in the next slide. But first, it was mentioned that pragmatism could be used to argue that accurately regarding reality is not both objectively and subjectively good for people. Okay, how? One of Frankl's logotherapy ideas is that having unrealistically high expectations for people helps them to actually accomplish their highest real potential. In other words, inaccurate beliefs lead to the best results. Pragmatism has no trouble showing this to be either true or false, depending on how Frankl's therapy actually does. So note that this would not make the unrealistic expectations accurate. They're still unrealistic, but rather it would demonstrate that aligning oneself to reality, i.e. more accurate is more healthy, is in fact not the best approach, and self or other deception yields the most health and wellness. So logotherapy is all about finding and nurturing what is meaningful to you. So Pierce and his often like-minded contemporary William James would likely have no problem admitting its potential value. So, aligning to reality, especially when this is hard, is the target of most psychology, and the pragmatic philosophy undergirding most of psychology acknowledges that it is the results of your attempting to do this, of your attempting to line up with reality, that determine the truth. And so they acknowledge that you have to pay attention and you have to cycle through the reasoning process. This brings us to our developmental model of epistemology. First of all, since this is development, we could start with Jean Piaget, who noted that we reorganize our knowledge schemes only as necessary. So in other words, it is only when we encounter a failure of our ability to act or understand effectively that we engage in accommodation. If our schemas are performing fine, we are in equilibrium with the world. If they start failing us, we experience disequilibrium and change our thinking. That process is occurring at all stages of this model, summarized in Deanna Kuhn's great textbook, Education for Thinking. Now, since this is a stages model, we should remind ourselves that passing a stage does not mean leaving it entirely behind. Stephen Jay Gould noted our tendency to focus on what's new in a given stage and forget what was already there and never left or never leaves. His example was that images of the Cretaceous period depict the Tyrannosaurus rex because that's where we first find the T-Rex. But these images don't highlight things like the coelacanths, because coelacanths have been around since the Devonian period and are still around today. So this leads people to forget that the coelacanths were also around in the Cretaceous period, and they're still around today, playing an important role in their own ecosystem. The analogy with epistemological development here is that we may develop new skills or priorities at later stages, but that does not mean prior skills and priorities have left us. The Cretaceous period may have been the age of the T-Rex, big and bad and impressive, but surviving through the Cretaceous and even afterwards are the coelacanths. They never went away, despite being overshadowed by later, cooler things. That said, these are the stages that most of us develop through as we age and gain experience, the epistemological stages. First, Realist. Something exists, therefore it is true. A, therefore A. Realist. Nice and simple. Ages 0 to 4 years old. You can expect this type of epistemology. Absolutist. Something exists, therefore it is true. But some people could be wrong about it. So it's A, therefore A, but maybe sometimes B by accident. Multiplist. Multiple opinions exist, therefore they are true, or false, or whatever. A and B, therefore A and B. Finally, evaluativist. Something exists and opinions exist, therefore we should see how well the opinions line up with the something. A and B, therefore A or B. Getting a little deeper now. Realist stage. Truth goes from reality to person or people, and it is not in our realm of consideration that this process could be broken or different for different people. Reality leads to truth. If I know that the cookies are in the cupboard and I know that Jenny wants a cookie, then I will be surprised, even as a toddler and an infant, if Jenny does not first look in the cupboard for the cookies. My knowledge should be everyone's knowledge. It's egocentrism. And we should all have the same beliefs because we all look at the same reality. In your intro psychology course, the textbook gives you a grown-up heuristic version of this, and it calls it the curse of knowledge. We assume that others will know what we know. This assumption could be seen as the foundation of the Aristotelian antimimetic argument, the hidden argument. So we have hidden or unstated premises because we think everyone knows that, in the example of the child arguing for a smartphone, the fairness is everyone having the same thing. So we all move beyond realism, but we do not leave it entirely behind. Even the philosophy of Peirce, as we just mentioned, includes the idea that reality is corrective. Reality is resistant to error, which is a tenet that Charles Peirce's philosophy shares with realist philosophies. The absolutist stage of the school-aged child, or rather, which starts with the school-aged child. The school-aged child knows that people can be correct or incorrect about things, but holds the idea that this correctness is determined by the absolute correct or incorrect nature of beliefs. The idea that in reality things are either true or untrue. So two young children might have an argument over which is bigger, the CN Tower or the Great Pyramid of Giza. Right or wrong is not up for challenge. The issue of whether or not one of them needs to be wrong is not going to be up for challenge. So try telling the kids that maybe the two of you mean two different things when you're saying bigger, and see how poorly that goes. But at some point, they will understand the importance of this question. The level of thinking here is what's demonstrated when we say it's a fact, as if that provides a premise for a conclusion. If we did state that, then it would just be circular reasoning or begging the question. The statement "it is a fact" is a placeholder for the actual evidence or demonstrability of that fact. Your conclusion is that X is a fact. An argument would consist in demonstrating how we know it's a fact. The first pangs of this growth in kids seems to be the use of authority. So who said it, which is still something that we need to appeal to for most of our knowledge, unfortunately. So how do you personally know that broccoli is healthy for you and bacon isn't? Very few of us could break down a convincing argument that is not circular. It's good for you because it has good things, vitamins in it, or an appeal to authority. It's a vegetable, and the Canada Food Guide says we need 7 servings of vegetables per day. Or we might just make an appeal to popularity, fall victim to the bandwagon fallacy. So, well, everybody learns that broccoli is good for you. We learn from our parents or our caregivers. The childlike idea of science as a body of facts is also an example of this. So if science says so, then it's true. This is also probably just an example of absolutist thinking. And a significant fraction of us humans do not develop our epistemology past the absolutist stage, especially if we've latched on to a very good system of appealing to different authorities, or appealing to one authority which does our thinking for us. But most of us move on to multiplist. So, where were we previously? Things are either true or not true, and we can find that out through authority figures, or through appealing to science. So let's develop into a multiplist and say something like, what if science is just another opinion? Well, welcome to the multiplist stage. In the absolutist stage, we learned to appeal to authority, but by the time we get to the multiplist stage, we have likely learned that authorities contradict themselves. Any one authority could contradict itself internally. So, unfortunately, the Catholic Pope cannot be both infallible and apologetic for past Pope mistakes. Maybe we realize that our religious doctrines contradict themselves. The necessity of the religious meme to benefit followers often comes in conflict with meeting the higher ideals of humanity and beneficence to all. Or maybe we are the victim of an injustice at the hands of the system or an individual that we've had high regard for. Our particular stories aside, we learn that there are alternatives and that the very thing we used to choose between the alternatives might be just another alternative. Add to that the social emotional pressures of adolescence, and one's epistemology often just washes out into the word whatever. If I do not choose, then I cannot be wrong. If I have no beliefs, then I cannot harm or offend anyone with them. Truth is a matter of taste, culture, preference. We each choose our preferred truth, and it's silly or wrong to tell someone that they are wrong. Oh wait, that doesn't scan, does it? Another challenge here is the magnitude of emotional response is huge when we're adolescents. We have trouble even as adults because we conflate what feels emotionally wrong with what is empirically wrong and what's morally wrong, as we've seen, for example, with conflict syllogisms, when we have trouble distinguishing what's logically wrong, if it's something we agree with or that something evokes emotion. So you can combine that entangled mess and then add in, an overactive emotional reasoning heuristic. So well, the more I feel it, the more it must be true, and then we can hardly blame youths for escaping into the welcoming nihilism of whatever they need to. As some of you may remember, being a multiplist is a terrible experience. Most of us do grow out of multiplism and further develop. Not all of us need to, though, if it doesn't serve our purpose to develop anything more than just a multiplist or a relativist view of things. To transition to the evaluativist stage, I'm gonna just quote Kuhn herself, page 32. Hoisting oneself out of the whatever well of multiplicity and indiscriminability is much harder than the quick and easy fall into its depths. By adulthood, many, though by no means all, adolescents will have reintegrated with the objective dimension of knowing and achieved the understanding that, while everyone has a right to their opinion, some opinions are in fact more right than others, to the extent that they are better supported by argument and evidence. Justification for a belief becomes more than personal preference. Whatever is no longer the automatic response to any assertion. There are legitimate discriminations and choices to be made, rather than facts or opinions. Knowledge at this evaluativist level of epistemological understanding consists of judgments, which require support in a framework of alternatives, evidence, and argument. This cognitive evolution cannot, by itself, yield the valuing of intellectual engagement, but it does provide an essential foundation for its development. Adolescents who never progress beyond the absolutist belief in certain knowledge, or the multiplist's equation of knowledge with personal preference, lack a reason to engage in sustained intellectual inquiry. If facts can be ascertained with certainty and are readily available to anyone who seeks them, as an absolutist understands, or if any claim is as valid as any other, as the multiplist understands, there is little point to expending the mental effort that the evaluation of claims entails. Only at the evaluativist level are thinking and reason recognized as essential support for beliefs and actions. Thinking is the process that enables us to make informed choices between conflicting claims. Understanding this leads a person to value thinking and to be willing to expend the effort that it entails. So we, or at least many of us, have finally graduated to judgment, despite being so rewarded for rejecting it in our multiplist adolescence. Let's give ourselves some tools to work with. Here's a problem. How do we break this down and understand this problem? Any problem has a current state and some sort of goal state. Hopefully, you can roughly define each of these things. And any given situation that has a current state and a goal state is going to have some givens. Since we're trying to multiply 12 by 76, We have the general principles of mathematics. These are the givens. We have the idea that there is a single correct answer to this question. But we also have, and this is why we say we have a problem, we also have obstacles. We have the limited computational power of our own brains. Maybe for some of us this is relatively easy to solve. Maybe for some of us this is torture to even look at. We have time. If I can't solve it in the time allotted, why should I try? Next, we are doing some sort of cost-benefit analysis before we get into trying to solve the problem. What benefit to me is it to solve 12 times 76? This is going to determine whether and how we approach solving a given problem. And I chose math as an example, not just because it's a concrete and bounded situation, but also because so many people have their self-images standing in the way of them even addressing simple math problems. If you fancy yourself bad at math, you may avoid the math problem. If you fancy yourself good at math, you may avoid the math problem. Why? Well, because if you screw up, then it'll be a threat to your self-image. Anxiety. How do we get around or through the anxiety we have regarding mathematical problems? These are all of the human elements that lie between us and our solution, between our current state and our goal state. Now, any of these obstacles could also be seen as frames or framings of the problem. So if I frame a mathematics problem in terms of anxiety, or in terms of me, or in terms of the cost or the benefits of the problem, these different framings are going to influence how, whether, and to what effect I solve the problem. Framing was summed up pretty nicely by Daniel Kahneman in his book Thinking Fast and Slow, when he said, people do not choose between things, they choose between descriptions of things. And while I'm pretty sure the behaviorists would disagree with that, it is probably true, or accurate, or useful in most situations. There are two great but contrasting approaches or philosophies to tackling problem solving or making decisions in general. Wisdom, discernment, judgment comes from knowing when to use or when to lean more heavily on one approach over the other. And these two approaches are, first, the measure twice, cut once approach, or my preferred statement of it from Abraham Lincoln: if I had 5 hours to chop down a tree, I would spend the first 4 sharpening my axe. So this is one approach to tackling problems. Do a lot of thinking, a lot of preparatory work, so that when you jump in, you're ready. The second approach, which is for the most part contrasting, is increase your fail rate. Iterate. Throw something out, see what sticks. If it doesn't stick well enough, you iterate, you change it based on the feedback that you get. It's also called rapid prototyping. This perfectionist approach, this prepare so that you're ready, could potentially paralyze you, though. So you could be Buridan's ass, caught between two options, and you don't know how to choose between them because you can't get the perfect answer. We often don't know which tools or measures, so sticking with the metaphors we've used, axes, we often don't know which tools or measures we will need till we start actually hacking at the problem. If you are more proactive, or what you might describe as a doer, then you probably prefer the second approach of increasing your fail rate. If you do take this approach, you may be wasting quite a bit of time addressing problems that a more reflective person would or could have seen coming. My wife works for an architectural engineering firm, and she's described to me an orders of magnitude rule of thumb, which is if it costs $1 to fix it in the planning stage, then it will cost $10 to fix it in the building stage, and it will cost $100 to fix it after the building has been built. And that makes a great case for the measure twice, cut once approach, but that's for building buildings, and not everything is building buildings. Other challenges, like maybe, trying to figure out how to talk to someone of the opposite sex when you're young and starting to get interested in such things. You can spend 4/5 of your time practicing chat-up lines and conversation starters in front of the mirror, but most of the good correctives that make you better at actually interacting with people will come from the non-verbal behaviors, the subtle responses that these actual individuals, these members of the opposite sex, will give you if you're actually interacting with them. So in that case, I would think increase your fail rate, iterate, and you'll get better by doing, not so much preparing. But of course, when you put either one of these strategies, the measure twice, cut once, or the increase your fail rate approach, into reality and realize that reality is a game that is played itself iteratively, then you realize you can use both strategies. You can talk to a whole bunch of people of the opposite sex and then go off and spend your 4 hours sharpening your axe and then come back and do it a little better. And you can spend a lot of time measuring twice and cutting once, making buildings that have been properly planned through, and yet still learning from all of the iterations of these well-planned buildings that have experienced failures over the years. Now, these two approaches, increasing your preparation versus increasing your fail rate, are not a mutually exclusive dichotomy. Presenting them both and saying that they're separate is not saying that there are two types of people in the world, perfectionists versus proactive people. I, in part, like the comparison because I believe I exist in both camps. I, for example, am proactive by temperament. I believe in my bones that actual learning happens most and most effectively when you're actively screwing up. Try it sometimes. Your limbic system has your back, and it will make you learn far better than the best cognitive simulations that you can come up with in your 4 hours of preparation. Yet, I'm a perfectionist by training. My grandfather showed me how to be 10 steps ahead of a process or a challenge by taking 10 steps back and considering it in the most painstakingly detailed manner possible. My father said that he couldn't play chess with my grandfather, despite having tried on multiple occasions, because my grandfather was too slow in choosing his moves, because he wanted to see everything mapped out ahead of time before he committed to anything. And I think I'm my father by temperament and my grandfather by training. Those of you who are a little more anxious might be like my grandfather by temperament, i.e. measure twice, cut once, but like my father by training, i.e. you've learned to force yourself to take a step before you know it's the perfect step. Either way, jumping into the solution of a problem does involve a leap. We tried for a couple decades modeling how people solve problems with the kind of perfect thinking model. We've presumed that people could somehow go through all possible options and then pick the best option from this list of all possible things. And then we realized that you would need infinite time to compute all the possible options for your actions, and then an infinite amount of time to compare any two of these options to each other. And then Herbert Simon came along and he said, well, we satisfice. Somehow we come up with an arbitrary cutoff for where we're satisfied with a solution. And once we satisfy that cutoff, that's when we've made a decision. And these two approaches, the more perfectionist one or the more impulsive, proactive one, could, by Herbert Simon's model, represent different thresholds for satisficing. When do you have enough information to act? If your satisficing threshold is lower, i.e. met quickly or more easily, then you may be able to iterate quicker, get feedback from the environment faster from your actions. But if your satisficing threshold is higher, well, maybe your first action is more effective. After all, a stitch in time saves 9. That said, if we're being honest, our first approach to solving a problem is usually actually not to tackle a problem like multiplication with our thinking, but rather with a device. Hence, we're going to start with cognitive offloading. So what's cognitive offloading? Doing something to reduce the load on your mind. With our example of a multiplication question, doing something to reduce the load on your mind would be reaching for a calculator. This will save your brain having to do some work. It's the same principle behind using your fingers in order to keep track of what you've counted. And if I tilt a page, your brain has to do a little bit more work, especially when you jump from one line to the next line to line them up. So the more tilted the page is, the more cognitive work you save by tilting your head with the page to adjust for the page's tilt. You are offloading the challenge of lining up the words properly that your brain would have to tackle into the world by tilting your head so that your brain does not have to tackle that translation. The language used in these paradigms is, if you don't tilt your head when you are reading tilted text, then you have to internally normalize the text, which is more work. So rather than normalize the text internally, you normalize it externally by tilting your head in order to make it easier for you to read the text. So offloading into the world is using objects to ease the cognitive demand. When you have to keep track of yourself across time, you can use intention offloading. If I intend to buy certain things at the grocery store, I can make sure I follow through on this intention by making a list. One of the big problems of memory is our faulty assumption that we will have as much ease recalling in the future what we recall with ease now. Oh, of course I'll remember this. See, I'm going to remember it right now. And then we list off the 5 things we're going to buy. So then we think, okay, well, that was easy for me to remember. I'll remember when I'm at the store these 5 things. It's great that you have confidence in yourself, but it's better to make a list. An example of how I offload intention is if I have to remember to take an object somewhere, I will put that object in front of the door. Or if I can't, then I will put a note pertaining to that object at the door. So if I want to be sure not to forget the presents for the in-laws, when we go to visit the in-laws, we'll put the presents right in front of the door. The one potential problem with this approach is if you put the presents for the in-laws in front of the door too early, then you may get used to climbing over those presents in order to get out the door. And when it comes time to go to the in-laws, you may, out of habit, step right over the presents, leaving them there to be discovered as soon as you step back into the house from having visited your in-laws. Now, one might predict from prior learning in this course that it would be better to offload intention than to be confident in one's memory. But interestingly, in the lab, what we tend to see is that if you have high confidence in your ability to remember, at least in lab tasks, your performance is roughly the same as those who had lower confidence but offloaded their intention, i.e. somebody who wrote a note. This suggests that those with higher confidence may be accurate in their self-assessment and their confidence in their ability to remember. So when participants are less confident, they are more likely to set a reminder for themselves, i.e. more likely to offload their intention into the world, which serves as an equalizer, i.e. brings their actual accomplishment of their intentions up to the same level as those who were confident enough that they didn't need to write or offload their intentions. So here's that relationship more simply displayed on a graph. Your metacognitive insight, i.e. your lower confidence in yourself to recall or to follow through on your intention, to the extent that it leads you to offload that intention, i.e. to set a reminder, that low confidence helps you to match the success of the higher confidence individuals. How about offloading into other people? This is called transactive memory, or memory we have with other individuals. There's a rough division of labor in my household. My wife seems to keep us on track in terms of time and scheduling, and I tend to keep everything organized in terms of place. So I tend to ask her questions like, what time are we leaving, or even what day is it? And she tends to ask me questions like, where do we keep the flour? Is there room in the freezer for the leftovers? And would the big bookshelf fit on the east wall? The point is, she is remembering the temporal things, and I am accessing her memory, and I am keeping track of the spatial things, and she is accessing my memory. We have transactive memory together. But of course, we have transactive memory not just with other people, but also with other things that might act as people. There's something called the Google effect, whereby our memories are getting worse because we can just Google things, so there's no reason to remember things anymore. How can I be so clueless as to not know what day it is? Well, I don't really have to know what day it is. I have a watch, I have a calendar, and I have my wife who takes care of such things. Why would you need to know historical dates or word definitions when all of those are in Google? Is there really that much of a threat that the power's going to go off or that the Wi-Fi's going to be off? Your brain seems to think not, so it goes right ahead and forgets anything that it can look up on Google. And this isn't just Google specific. So about a decade ago, Sparrow and Wagner noticed that the idea of computers seemed to be primed whenever individuals were faced with difficult questions, i.e. the types of questions one might want to offload onto a processing or a thinking or a looking the answer up machine. Moreover, if there's even the idea that whatever facts or details that are in front of you will somewhere or somehow be stored somewhere else, your brain seems to get this message and then process and retain what is in front of you less thoroughly and less well. We saw this in the memory lecture with pictures. The better the picture you took of the thing, the worse your memory will be for it, generally. But replacing the memory for the thing that you took a good picture of will be a memory for where that picture is stored. Neat experiments involving file folders on PCs have shown that as your recall for the thing itself decreases, your recall for where the information is stored on a computer increases. I encounter this conundrum often when a student asks me a good, incisive question, and rather than recall the answer to it, I can recall the book I have that the answer could be found in. So other examples of transactive memory: your relationship with your GPS is a complicated one. It makes life easier for you, but it also tunes you out from life in interesting ways. One might predict that if you have cognitively offloaded the task of navigating to your destination, that might free up your mind for attending to things that you see on the way to your destination. But in fact, it tends to turn off your brain more generally. People in cognitive science studies recall less about a drive in general if they had the GPS on. Without the GPS, your brain is turned on to process things other than just navigating. And of course, since you relied on a GPS to navigate for you, you would be less able to successfully navigate that route without GPS in the future. Not only that, you will, in part as an accurate interpretation of your lowered ability given you've used GPS, you will be less confident in your ability to navigate on your own, making you more likely to rely even more on the GPS, which is a feedback loop now of two things: decreasing confidence because you have a decreasing ability to navigate on your own, and an increasing dependence on the GPS. And of course, there's the camera phone's example. The better the picture you take, the worse your independent memory seems to be of the event. If we know things like memory storage and problem solving are being taken care of by something else, whether it's GPS or a camera phone or our spouse, we get worse at recalling and executing it. So we correctly get less confident in ourselves, at least in cases where we know we are dependent. So spell check has made us worse spellers, and correctly decreased our confidence in our ability to spell. Calculators have made us worse calculators, and correctly decreased our confidence in our ability to calculate things. And using GPS or Google Directions makes us less able to navigate routes that we have driven successfully, and correctly lowers our confidence in our ability to do so. These are all cases where we appear to have insight into ourselves and our dependence on offloading onto technology. It was mentioned that knowing we could look something up decreases our tendency to remember that thing, so one would think that use of Google would reduce our confidence in our ability to remember things. But we seem to have the opposite relationship with Google. For example, if we give participants a trivia quiz and we randomize such that one group can use Google in order to answer the trivia questions and another group cannot, we find that those in group 1 tend to rate their memory as being better than those in group 2. They assess their information processing as higher or better, and when we ask people to put their money where their mouth is and predict how well they're going to do on future quizzes, explicitly telling these Group 1 members that in the future they will not be able to use Google, the Group 1 individuals inflate their expectations regarding themselves and make much higher predictions for how well they will do than Group 2. And it goes a bit deeper than that. We don't just take credit for Google, which is essentially what the Group 1 individuals were doing. We actually come to see ourselves as having the positive traits of Google, e.g. good memory, good information processing. And the easier and more intuitive the interface of Google gets, i.e. the easier it is to get your intended answer, the smarter people tend to think that they are without Google, it's a testament to the programming and the intuitive interface of Google that the normal relationship we have with our cognitive offloading tools like calculators and GPS is reversed with Google. We don't think that because we've used a calculator in the past and it made math easy, that we can do math without a calculator. And yet, results seem to show that we tend to think we're wicked smart because we've looked stuff up on Google before. Google is likely driving a global Lake Wobegon effect with a nefarious undertow, such that as people think that they are increasingly above average in their intelligence and problem-solving abilities, the thing that is giving them such confidence is actually taking those skills away. But of course, as long as the power is on and the Wi-Fi is on, there's really no harm to this offloading process. As long as no EMPs wipe out the calculators, we don't need engineers to know how to do long division. So there are obvious strengths to offloading. It's going to save you time and effort, and it's probably less prone to error. Certainly this is the case for calculators and calendars. But beware of offloading, creating dependency, and beware of the overconfidence that comes, or the underconfidence that comes, from having been able to offload in the past. So let's compare algorithms with heuristics. An algorithm is something that is guaranteed to give you a solution. The most common formula we use in statistics is the formula for the mean. You just follow the steps. You take all the observations you have, you add them all together, and you divide the sum by the number of observations that you summed. This, by definition and by process, is guaranteed to give you the mean. This does not ensure that the mean is the correct answer to whatever question you're attempting to address with the mean, but the algorithm gives you the mean every time. As most of you hopefully remember from high school, the algorithm for multiplying 12 by 76 would go a little like this. You start by multiplying 2 and 6. Since it gives you a number above 9, you're going to have to carry the value in the tens column and put it up by the 7. Since 2 times 6 is 12, the 2 goes down in the ones column of the product, and the little red 1 is carried. Next, we multiply 2 and 7, which gives us 14, but then we add the carried 1, which gives us 15. So far, so good. We are 1/3 of the way through the process. Next, we use a 0 placeholder in the ones column of the second row of our solution. Then we multiply 1 by 6 to get 6, and 1 by 7 to get 7. The final third of our algorithmic journey involves adding these two rows of product together. 2 plus 0 is 2, 5 plus 6 is 11, carry the 1 from the tens column of 11, 7 plus 1 is 8, plus 1 is 9, so we have our sum, which is our product. 12 times 76 is 912. This is how I learned to do it, and if you were lucky, it's also how you learned to do it. This demonstrates the strength of algorithms because we have simple, broken down, guaranteed steps that lead you to the correct answer. But of course, breaking things down could cost you extra time, and just because it is an algorithm doesn't necessarily make it the correct tool for whatever job you have to do. If the initial question was, when was somebody born if they were 12 in the year 1976? Then multiplying 12 by 76 is probably not the best tool for the job. There are subtraction algorithms for that. But let's tackle that problem using heuristics, mental shortcuts that tend to save us time and energy and tend to be correct, but also lead us into predictable errors. How can I solve 12 times 76 without breaking out the algorithms, without remembering my grade 4 math? Well, some of you may have been trained in something called mental math. I have had 2 different students in my psychology of education classes who were diagnosed with mathematics disorder, who had been in grade schools that used the mental math approach, and they only clawed their way out from under that diagnosis by going back and learning grade school math algorithmically. In other words, this so-called intuitive, holistic approach to teaching math appears to be giving university-level thinkers specific learning disabilities. So here's how it works. Since 10 times anything is very easy to compute, I can break off a 10 from the 12 and multiply 10 by 76, since I know it's just going to be 76 with another 0 on the right side. What remains should be a little more manageable than the full 12, i.e. what remains is 2 times 76. So what I have now, rather than one complicated problem, are two slightly easier problems. I just have to remember to add the two products together at the end. So 10 times 76 is 760, and 2 times 76 is 152. Adding them together, I get 912. But of course, since this is a rather ad hoc heuristic approach, this isn't the only way to arrive at a solution using mental or holistic or intuitive math. Let's come up with another heuristic option. Let's say I don't like the 76, but I'm okay with 75. Maybe I've recently done some units on percentages or fractions, so I happen to like 75 because it neatly represents 3/4 of 100. So my simplification in this case is to multiply 12, not by 76, but by 75. And then I just have to remember to add in that 12 that I took off the 76 after I've multiplied 12 by 75. But of course I haven't actually made the 12 by 75 quite easy enough. So I'm going to use the same trick that we used last time, and I'm going to break down 12 times 75 into 10 times 75 plus 2 times 75. So my heuristic simplification gives me 10 times 75 plus 2 times 75 plus 12. Now I have two sufficiently easy products that I add together and then sum with 12. And of course what I'm doing now is I'm chaining heuristics, which is fine as long as you remember the neat concatenated path that you've made for yourself and how to reconstitute the values together after you've made this god-awful mess. But look how nice my final line is now. I just need to add 750 by 150 and 12. I get 912 again. Whenever I give this lecture, there are at least two people who put up their hand and say, I was taught math this way, and I've never had any students defend this way of learning math. The general response of students who were taught this intuitive approach over the algorithmic approach is that they were ripped off. The usual next question is, why would anyone teaching math use this approach? The justification was, when you look at how people, adults in the real world, do math, they tend to use this approach, a heuristic approach where they break things down into simpler problems so they can solve those simpler problems and then hopefully remember to put things back correctly in the end. So the teachers' college instructors, in all of their vast wisdom, said we're going to teach people to use this approach right from the beginning so maybe they get better at it if that's what they're going to do in the end anyway. Now there's lots of room in math for neat shortcuts, but my advice is don't teach shortcuts before you teach navigation, and let's not throw out maps. So we saw that the heuristic approach uses the simpler, easier, and more familiar, and if I only need approximate numbers, you can imagine how powerful this holistic and intuitive approach might be. But imagine, especially if in my chaining heuristics example, I forgot how to recompose the answer. I forgot to add that last 12 or the 150. It's easy to break the rules that you just made on the spot. And arguably, especially that second heuristic example, the so-called simpler or quicker heuristic approach could not only make us more prone to error, but could actually increase the effort that it takes for us to solve a rather straightforward problem. That said, like most humans, I do tend to use the intuitive, heuristic, holistic approach when I'm solving math problems. It's only the training from my grandfather that makes me pause and say, wait, maybe I should do this correctly. The heuristic approach tends to be comfortable and it's usually good enough, and if we have expertise in the topic or experience in the topic, our ability to utilize shortcuts might be very impressive. There's a whole course called Street Fighting Math, where people learn to apply on the fly quick and dirty tricks to get the correct mathematical answer. But if you're not a math major and you haven't aced that course, you might want to heed the cautions of heuristics, which are their questionable accuracy due to their not being the guaranteed way to find the correct answer, and they're potentially adding labor to your solution quest. Moreover, if the approach feels more familiar or intuitive to you, that sense may prevent you from checking your work, which hopefully you also learned how to do algorithmically in grade school. Next, creativity. Creativity is generally broken down into two parts, or aspects. You have divergent creativity and you have convergent creativity. With divergent creativity, we are trying to assess how open and widely ranging your mind is in terms of the potential associations that it can come up with. One approach that kind of plays out like a game is headlines. What we might do here is we might get you to read an article that is several paragraphs and then write a headline that succinctly and in a way that grabs attention summarizes what the article is about. Here you obviously get points for being accurate about the contents of the article and for capturing its various topics, but the creative challenge is not to come up with a headline, it's to come up with a bunch of headlines. And the more headlines which are both accurate and informative about the article below them that you can come up with, the higher your divergent creativity score will be. Now, some of you may be thinking that how well you perform on such a task is going to depend quite a bit on the mood you're in, and you are quite correct. In positive psychology, we have something called the broaden and build hypothesis. The observation is that whereas depression narrows your worldview, your emotional range, your desires, as you withdraw, happiness does the opposite and broadens you out, in part by making you more creative, helping you to see more solutions to problems, make connections across more divergent things, and see more solutions. The idea not being that all of those solutions will be good, but that having more may lead to one or more better ones than having fewer. My favorite study from the broaden and build literature was the Dr. Lollipop study. Now, apparently, it is very difficult to diagnose liver disease. A lot of the presenting symptoms point to other, more common diseases, so we were interested in seeing what would help doctors more accurately diagnose liver disease. And we landed on candy. Doctors were randomized to either just make a case determination, the control group, or to receive a candy and then determine the diagnosis of a case, the treatment group. And the doctors who got a 10-cent candy were statistically better at diagnosing the difficult-to-diagnose liver disease. And this is an example of broaden and build because what tends to prevent the doctors from diagnosing liver disease is that the symptoms tend to present like more common disorders. The working theory here is that the candy leads to happiness, which leads to divergent creativity, which leads to considering the less common diagnosis, which leads to the realization that it's correct. And broaden and build is also applied to convergent thinking as well. So let's say I have a riddle type of problem for you, or a problem that has a specific solution. Generally, these types of problems are tricky because there is an obvious answer that is wrong that we tend to get stuck on, or partial solutions that distract us from solving the full problem. The best example for convergent creativity would be the remote associates test. Give the word that connects these other words together. Call, pay, and line. The word is phone. Phone call, pay phone, and phone line. How about this one? French, car, and shoe. I don't know how often y'all use shoehorns, but French horn, car horn, and shoehorn. Despite not being classed as difficult, this one tends to be tricky for students. Mower, foreign, and atomic. The word connecting them is power. A power mower, a foreign power, and atomic power. Give this one a shot. Board, magic, and death. Blackboard, black magic, and the Black Death. Weight, out, and pencil. This one's a little trickier. This one is lead, so lead weight, lead out, and lead pencil, or pencil lead. For a fun COVID-19 isolation activity you can do by yourself or over the internet with a friend, go to the remoteassociatestest.com Not only do they have 100 odd of these, but they're also labeled as to their difficulty level, so you can have a lot of fun. Now, one of the psychological theories that really got me interested in psychology in high school was incubation theory. The idea that we can come to creative solutions by walking away from the problems that we're trying to solve. This can also serve as a good introduction to the unconscious, because what appears to happen is your brain appears to keep working on the problem, despite your attention being shifted somewhere else. There's a few famous examples from history. There's Watson and Crick's discovery of the shape or structure of DNA. There's Archimedes leaping out of the bathtub and saying "Eureka." And there's a pretty good quote from John Cleese that I can't specifically recall, but it's roughly, sometimes I'll go to bed having a problem to solve, and I'll wake up not only having the solution to the problem, but also having no idea how I could possibly not have had the solution before. Now, with Cleese's example, you have the important aspect of sleep consolidation. In refiring and consolidating the events of the day, the brain perhaps fortuitously wired some aspects of the problem to some aspects of the solution. So you may know some people who say they do their best thinking in the shower, maybe because it's a frame change, maybe because it's relaxing, maybe because it helps you think of something else so that your unconscious can solve the problem. And perhaps we should specify here that those touting incubation theory would use the longer term cognitive unconscious to dissociate themselves from Freudian connotations. Incubation theory is used to explain how we come to insight problems seemingly all of a sudden. So insight problems are those that there's no halfway solution. You're either there at the solution or you're not. Or at least that's how we experience them. My favorite example is this. Two boys were born on the same day, month, and year, to the same parents, and they are not twins. How can this be? Now just imagine the class working on the problem for a few minutes, or at least what feels like a few minutes, and then a couple light bulbs going off, and someone putting up their hand saying they were triplets or quints. The experience of coming to this solution is not generally one of a reasoned, logical, process of elimination type of thinking. The experience of coming to the answer is rather, well, I all of a sudden had it. Incubation theory has also been used to explain why the best strategy for solving remote associates questions, like the ones from 3 slides ago, is actually to not try to solve them. Rather, let your mind wander, and the solution will probably come to you. This is in contrast to an analytic approach, where you try to reason things out. In other words, you do better at the remote associates test if you just relax and let your cognitive unconscious incubate the problem and throw a solution at you. Either approach will work, but mind wandering works better on average at getting you solutions to remote associates questions. Now, solving problems. Nearly every model says we are split in terms of how we solve problems. We have a system 1, an unconscious, intuitive, copy-paste, save your brain cells work type of system, and system 2, which brings the tools of culture, language, logic, and traceability to a more formal and explicit approach of working out the problem. Since system 1 is usually correct, we use it to solve most of our problems. But one challenge that leaves us with is system 1 is not traceable. For the most part, we lack insight into how or why we used system 1 to arrive at the solutions we did. For an analogy, there's an old story from the Life's Like That section of Reader's Digest, which was my bathroom reading when I was a kid. And the story was about a woman cooking a turkey on Thanksgiving for the first time. One thing she did was she grabbed a knife and she cut off the end of the bone that protrudes from the drumsticks of either leg of the turkey. And that didn't make much sense to the husband, since that's a perfectly good handle for when you're eating the drumstick. So he asked her, "Why did you cut the drumstick bone off when you cooked the turkey?" The wife responded, "Well, that's how you have to do it to cook the turkey." which is, of course, not an explanation. It's simply a restatement of the conclusion that she came to. When the husband pushed for an explanation, she finally said, okay, well, I guess I don't know. This is just how my mother did it, and I learned from her. But what they were able to do was they were able to call the mother and ask, why is it that you cut the bones off of the legs, the protruding bone part off of the drumstick legs, when you cook a turkey? And the mother's response was cackling laughter. In the mother's house, either the turkey pot or the stove was too small to accommodate the turkey, so the mother had to saw off the protruding bone parts. Her daughter, who did not have this space restriction, did not have to do this. So she found out her reason for engaging this behavior was not an appropriate reason, so she didn't have to do that anymore. The point of the story is that she was able to call her mother and ask where this particular behavior or habit came from. When we're dealing with System 1, we actually can't go back and ask. It's not traceable like System 2. So in the analogy, we would end up stuck at the stage where she's justifying the behavior, but not with a coherent argument, and rightly being questioned for it without an adequate response. An example you might be familiar with would be what have been called the 7 most costly, damaging, and dangerous words in business. We have always done it this way. This is not a reason. It's just question begging. If I'm asking you why a policy exists, or why your management is structured the way it is, saying this is how you do it does not inform the question. Can you email the test data to me? We don't do it that way. Well, that's not a reason. We never give reasons. Well, nothing you say means anything. Well, that's how we've always done it. It's tough to improve when you're not sure what your process is, because it's difficult to know what you might change. But of course, your brain doesn't tell you that your reasons are untraceable. Rather, your brain gives you reasons. They're just not necessarily the right ones. The word we have for this is confabulation. For most of your decisions, your System 1, your copy-paste, intuitive system, solves the problem for you, and then you justify whatever behavior you engaged in. Specifically, the left hemisphere of your brain acts as a press secretary and justifies your every behavior in the most socially acceptable and reasonable way it can. The dramatic version of this is Capgras syndrome. You wake up and things feel different. You used to feel certain emotions when you look at individuals, and now you do not. And rather than conclude that maybe the emotion centers of your brain have been affected by some sort of neural insult, you conclude that your loved ones that you now do not feel that affection for have been replaced by aliens, monsters, robots, clones, simulations, spies. In other words, imposters. And in order to justify that confabulation, there must likely, of course, be other conspirators, like the therapist who is trying to convince you perhaps your family members are not replicants. In Capgras syndrome and in split brain patients is likely where we see confabulation in its purest form. And the patients are just trying to make sense of their experience. But since most of us do not have Capgras syndrome, let's look at a more relatable example. We had some students watch a video and then answer questions about it, but some of the questions were tricky in that in order to answer the questions, you had to treat as if they were serious some false statements. So the question, what did the boy say was stolen, introduces something false because the boy did not say that anything was stolen, and yet you must answer that question. A week later, participants come back into the lab, and we ask them what they recall seeing from the video. We include some things that were not in the video, including the false statements that they made in response to the leading question, or questions, and 20% of those false statements end up being recalled as seen. Also included were some false statements or false responses from other participants that the individuals had not themselves made, of which 10% were incorrectly recalled as seen in the video, further demonstrating that we're more prone to misremember or misendorse things that we came up with. Now, the example I gave you was of college students in the US. If we do the same thing with younger and younger students, we see more and more impressive feats of erroneous memory. such that once you get down to the first graders, they are recalling more than half of the false, misled statements they made as having been in the video. The point is one we've seen before. Creating the explanation ourselves makes us twice as likely to think it is real or correct. This is what I call the small problem of confabulation. Our left hemisphere comes up with an explanation for the solution or decision that our system 1 just kludged together, and then we like it and think that that confabulation is accurate. So far, I would say that's just a small problem. We believe ourselves. That doesn't seem too terrible. But the big problem of confabulation, as I see it, is that our confabulations usually have an element of truth to them. And unfortunately, where we have an element of truth, we tend not to look much further. We have accomplished partial correctness. Now let's consider a relatively harmless example of partial correctness. We say something like, I ate pasta last night because I love pasta. You are, of course, not wrong. But that is also, of course, not the full reason for why you ate pasta, or not the full story of why you ate pasta. There's also situational factors, like you had pasta available, the ingredients were there. You also had the time to cook or order pasta, the means, something made you think of pasta, some stimulus or set of stimuli led to your response. You had the knowledge of how to make or get pasta. And there was an absence of more attractive options. Or, if they were present, you didn't think of them. If this seems rather pedantic, good, I want you to get that feeling from this example. Why would I consider all of these other contextualizing factors when I do love pasta, and that is, at least in part, or at least in the largest or most important part to me, why I ate the pasta? Well, some creative looks at partial correctness have revealed, for example, that people will, on average, choose to get paid less for the same job, choose to move to a location that they preferred less to move to, and to accept fewer benefits at said job in order to have a male boss rather than a female boss. And this misogyny is stronger in females than in males. In these clever studies, we ask people about many scenarios, so we can statistically throw them together and see which aspects of the scenario seem to be driving their decisions. And it turns out that one of the factors that leads people to make suboptimal choices is the sex of the boss in the story. Now, the point here isn't the prejudice in society. The point is that when we ask people what was driving the decisions that they made over the course of this long experimental session, none of them state that behind the decisions they made was in part their desire not to have a female boss. For each scenario, they had a reason, including when we asked them why they would accept less money. A response that would come up is, well, there would be more pressure if I was being paid more. Participants came up with all sorts of explanations when confronted with their decisions, but tended not to discover their own gender bias. One thing we do quite often is we study the cheating behavior of students. An older paradigm for this is seeing whether they change answers when they have to, or when they get to, grade their own test. This is actually fairly common, and when we confront students about why they cheated by changing their answer from an incorrect one to a correct one when they were supposed to be just grading their work, the most common response is that, oh, I meant to choose the right answer. In other words, it was a slip of the pen. My intention was to choose the correct one. I knew the correct answer, and was therefore only making the world more just by correcting what was a motor mistake and not a knowledge mistake. Now, in some sense, these students are not necessarily lying, because they appear to believe these confabulations. I.e., for all we can tell, these students really believe that they had, back when they selected the wrong answer, intended to choose to bubble in a different response. In other words, they believe their own confabulations. And yet, when we present these same students with these same confabulations as stated by other students, they do not believe said students. Oh, that person said that they meant to choose the correct answer, but they didn't? Well, that might have been true when I said it, but it's of course not true when they said it. Sounds like bull to me. Now, we can even feed this contradiction back to them and say, so you do not believe this excuse or explanation when it's said by someone else, but you believe it of yourself. And they will respond with, yes, because it's true when I say it and not when they say it. Now, these students are, of course, partially correct, because I am sure when they saw the correct answer, what motivated them to believe their confabulation that they had intended to select a different answer is that seeing the correct answer reminded them of what they already knew. So they're partially correct that, in some sense, despite the fact that they didn't recall it at the time of answering the initial question, they did have the knowledge that could have answered the question. So they're partially correct. And I would argue that this is the big problem, or the big barrier between their current state of knowledge and the truth. They're not entirely wrong, so why should they update their belief and maybe realize that their initial wrong answer was earnestly chosen at the time? So there's all sorts of difficulty involved in believing that we have biases, and there's difficulty in admitting that we have biases. And keep in mind that biases is not used with negative connotations here. A bias is a leaning toward a given response, answer, preference, feeling, etc. It's not synonymous with prejudice. And there's arguably even more difficulty in spotting how we are biased, in part because our partial correctness, conferred by our confabulations, satisfies our need for understanding. Your confabulations are yours, they are sensible to you, available to you. Since they come from you, they are usually valuable to you, and often they are nice and simple. There generally isn't much call for a multifaceted explanation. So our small problem of confabulation was, right or wrong, we tend to like what we come up with. And the big problem of confabulation is, we tend to come up with something that's at least partially correct. And if we're not wrong, there isn't much to motivate further investigation. Okay, but what does this have to do with problem solving? Confabulation tends to prevent us from noticing problems, or from looking for the solutions to the problems that we do notice. Since we have some confabulated explanation, which may provide us with a partial solution, we may not see the need to look much farther than what our left hemisphere provided us with. There's a related concept called functional fixedness, which is the observation that when we are presented with an object that already has a purpose, we tend to be less capable of seeing that object as having other purposes. I.e., we get stuck in whatever frame or scheme or image was originally provided to us. Once something has a function, we tend to have trouble thinking of other functions for it. It's an imperfect analogy, but the idea with confabulation is, once we have an explanation, we tend to get stuck on it. A classic example is the candle problem. You have a candle and a box full of thumbtacks. You want to attach the candle to the wall. How do you do it? Whether or not you come up with the desired solution is going to depend on how I present the items to you. If I present you with the thumbtacks inside the box, you are less likely to arrive at the desired solution, which is to tack the box to the wall and put the candle on the box. If I instead present you with the tacks dumped out of the box, you are more likely to see the box as a potential little shelf for the candle and come up with, i.e. converge upon, the solution of using the box as a little shelf for the candle. Seeing the function of the tack box as a box rather than a shelf makes you less likely to land on the idea of using the box as a shelf. In other words, improving our thinking or our explanations is difficult because our own thinking gets in the way, and the smarter we tend to be, the better we are at justifying whatever thinking is currently in our way. In this sense, intelligence can and does make fools and fanatics, while those armed with protective thinking tools to counteract motivated reasoning turn their intelligence to the task of doubting and growing wise. In a sense, whether reality teaches you something depends in part on your approach to reality. The shallow version of this being confirmation bias, or the biases we discussed that are associated with Google, and the deeper version of this being the philosophy of pragmatism. So we are most teachable when our models and beliefs are succinct enough and actionable enough to be tested by reality in a way that they could fail to be effective. Two lawyers are in the break room at the law firm. One's making toast, and as he's buttering the toast, he says, "Have you ever noticed that whenever you drop a piece of toast, it always falls butter side down? It's always the worst case scenario." Without saying anything, the second lawyer steps on the first lawyer's foot. Ow! The first lawyer drops his toast, but it lands butter side up. And the second lawyer says, "Well, it looks like you've lost that case." But the first lawyer just says, "Yeah, or I buttered the wrong side." The first lawyer has an unfalsifiable belief about what happens when you drop a piece of toast. He does not get to learn from reality when reality shows him that in fact a dropped piece of toast could land on either side. Rather than learn that, he adds to his strange biased theory that there is some cosmically correct side on which to butter your toast. Recall that falsifiability requires your idea, your belief, your hypothesis to be capable of being tested and proven incorrect. The reason why this guy from the History Channel specials about how aliens built the pyramids is not considered a scientist, or rather his ideas are not scientific, specifically because they can't be shown to be incorrect. They also don't add too much to our understanding of the world, but his idea that aliens constructed the pyramids can't be shown to be incorrect. This guy can't learn from a reality that includes him being incorrect. It's verifiable because aliens or ninth dimensional beings could come and visit us and say, "Hey, how are our pyramids doing? Did you take good care of them?" No, typical three-dimensional beings. Or we could discover some cool remains that are exobiological. There's potential ways to corroborate or demonstrate correct his theory, or the hypothesis of aliens having built the pyramid. But if it happens to be the case that we live in the universe where the pyramids on Earth were not built by aliens, this guy doesn't get to find out about it because we have no current way to search the entirety of the universe for signs of alien life. And even if we did have that technology, there's nothing to say that these aliens aren't ninth dimensional beings that are completely undetectable with our current level of science. Consider a scenario where aliens come back to Earth and they say, "Oh yes, we were on Earth before. Hello, we're back." And then we say, "Oh, great. Did you guys make the pyramids when you were here before?" And they say, "No, we didn't make the pyramids." And then we say, "Oh, do you know who did? Have we therefore falsified the idea that aliens made the pyramids?" No, not necessarily. This alien could be lying to us, and maybe they did build the pyramids, but they don't want credit for it. Or maybe it was a different set of aliens that built the pyramids, because now we've just demonstrated that intelligent life exists and can visit us. So if anything, this refusal or denial from the first set of aliens we met just might make us more likely to believe that there's some other set of aliens that made the pyramids. Now, this is not to say that it is impossible to falsify a theory that involves aliens making the pyramids. All this guy would have to do, all this History Channel guy would have to do, is make his theory sophisticated enough and specific enough that he can specify what observations in reality would disconfirm his hypothesis that aliens built the pyramids, or disconfirm other hypotheses that constitute his theory. If he could point us to specific instances or observations or things that are possible to observe, that we could possibly observe in the future, that if we saw them would discorroborate his idea that aliens built the pyramids, then he would have a scientific hypothesis on his hands, a scientific theory. But the therefore aliens guy doesn't do that. The Egyptologists and archaeologists who do create falsifiable statements or models of how the pyramids were built get specific enough that they'll posit things like, well, I imagine if you had 4 strong people with levers or log rollers, and you had a ramp inclined at an 8-degree grade, you could probably move a boulder as big as this large boulder up to where we find it on the Pyramid of Giza today. So this academic picks the biggest, most challenging piece and says, if my theory works for this most difficult piece to move, then it'll probably work for the smaller pieces as well. So there's actually a few principles being used here. First, you want to test your idea where your idea is most likely to fail, because that's the most stringent test. If I say I'm the world champion, I'm the best possible arm wrestler in the world, I don't prove that by saying it. I can't prove that if I've never arm wrestled somebody. And my falsifiable test is not going to be me arm wrestling your grandmother. If I actually want to test the idea that I'm the best arm wrestler in the world, I have to wrestle the strongest available individual, i.e. I have to test my assertion where it is most likely to fail if I want it to be taken seriously at all. So we're specifying what would prove our theory wrong, and we're looking for the test most capable of proving our theory wrong. And this is how we're demonstrating that the idea is worthy of being taken seriously. An example that I particularly like regarding falsifiability is the end of the world. Let's say someone is telling me that the end of the world is coming, because people are telling us this, whether they're religious leaders, doomsday cultists, global warming alarmists, ancient civilizations that left behind calendars with abrupt endings. There's always at least one person telling us the world is ending. But it takes a particular sort of chutzpah to specify a date. So the Christian idea of rapture is the removal of individuals from earth up to the heavens. I was only 7 years old in 1992, but I don't recall a rapture happening. I do remember these billboards, though. These could be found in Toronto. The Bible guarantees Judgment Day, May 21st, 2011. Thank you for the heads up, familyradio.com. But of course, Judgment Day is a little vague. I don't recall seeing any Arnold Schwarzenegger robots on May 21st, 2011, but I'm not sure that that's what Judgment Day entails. I do know what Earth destruction means, though, and 3 months after May 21st, the Earth was supposed to be destroyed, and I don't think that happened, despite the fact that the Bible guaranteed it, though I don't recall that verse. And here's the example that likely more of us remember: the end of the world due to the end of the Mayan calendar. Now, to be fair, nowhere was it written that the end of the world had to occur quickly. So maybe the end of the world started ending, and maybe for the past 7 odd years, the world has been slowly ending. But aside from my overly charitable interpretation here, I think we can safely say that these calls for the end of the world were falsified. So I assume a lot of the scaremongers then apologized after the date, after October 21st, 2011. I'm sure Harold Camping came out and said, "Oh, sorry, my bad." I'm sure he got out and carried a sign around like this that said, "Yesterday in this space I predicted that the world would come to an end. It did not, however, so I regret any inconvenience this may have caused." But just because there's no apology doesn't mean that learned nothing. Here's the Bible guarantees it. Judgment Day crowd after May 21st, 2011. Well, something did happen on May 21st, 2011. It was just an invisible thing. The Lord, in her infinite wisdom, decided to judge the good and the bad people, such that if you were born after May 21st, 2011, you were apparently born damned because God stopped saving people. But what I want to point out is that the language changed. Rather than saying the earth will be destroyed on October 21st, 2011, this group is saying there's a strong likelihood that October 7th, 2015 will be the end of the world. Baby steps in epistemic development. And if you want, down at the bottom of the poster there's a Facebook page. You can go there and see what they've been doing for the last 5 years. See if they've got another date for the end of the world. Also see whether they're making cool posters like this still. The Last Day 2015, starring Strong Likelihood. This is progress, this is development, because they're acknowledging that they may be wrong. And the words in red are just a bit of a play on a popular Bible verse. So recognizing that we might be wrong is the beginning of wisdom. Some of you may know the original proverb, "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom." And we can put those together and say something along the lines of, nothing quite puts the fear of God in you like being wrong, or learning that you could be wrong. And I typically hold this up as an example of individuals not learning from being wrong, but they are. They're just not learning what most of us would probably prefer for them to learn, which is not to make random doomsday prophecies. Even if they haven't yet learned not to make doomsday prophecies, they at least have learned that maybe this prophecy could be incorrect. This would be a win for Charles Peirce, who we saw argued that reality is corrective of error. The words strong likelihood indicate that these individuals do in fact have the fear of being wrong, the beginning of wisdom. Saying strong likelihood, at least compared to saying the Bible guarantees it, is aporia. Aporia is an acknowledgement or a profession of doubt, of uncertainty. And I put Socrates up here because when I read Socratic dialogues, the turn toward aporia is for me the big action climax of the dialogue. The typical recipe for a Socratic dialogue is you have Socrates, and Socrates wants to meet the expert on a given topic, whether the topic is love or justice or truth, because he has so many questions. Because Socrates admits that he knows nothing, so he wants to ask the most basic questions of these experts. And he does over the course of the dialogue. But over the course of the dialogue, he starts to reveal through his questions and through the expert or his interlocutor's answers to those questions, he starts to reveal that the expert might not know as much as he thinks he does. And over the course of the dialogue, the expert comes to realize this and eventually has a moment where they either admit or explicitly reveal that they do not know that of which they speak or that of which they are an expert. And, of course, to make themselves feel better about their ignorance, they attribute infinite wisdom to Socrates for having revealed or demonstrated their own lack of knowledge. Which, by the way, the psychodynamicists have a defense mechanism name for that. It's called valuation. Oh, you're smarter than me? Well, to protect my ego, I'm going to say that you're probably the smartest person in the world. But of course, Socrates is wise because he says, I know nothing. The fact that my ignorance got you to reveal yours does not imply that I am wise. But of course, we never quite believe Socrates. We think both that he must be wise and he probably knows it. But both Socrates and his interlocutor in any given dialogue are showing us how to grow wisdom. They're engaging in questioning, picking things apart, looking for inconsistency. A Socratic dialogue is a demonstration of how simple discussion can lead us to truth, and this is key to Platonic ideas of truth. You'll come through discussion to the perfect idea of truth, or the core idea of what justice is or love is, if you engage in discussion. The discussion will show you the truth, and it is a truth regarding your mind. Socrates is, in a sense, not necessarily wise himself, but maybe a source or a catalyst of wisdom. If you're pretty sure about something you know, and you have a chat with Socrates, and the chat with Socrates reveals to you that you actually don't know something you thought you knew really well, then you gained wisdom. That's not necessarily wisdom that Socrates specifically had that he gave to you. Rather, in your discussion with Socrates, he helped you to make your own wisdom. He provided a test for you. Rather than accepting everything you said as the expert in your field, he questioned. And while that revealed you to be wrong, the human intellect is rather anti-fragile with regards to correction, even if this is not necessarily true of the human ego. So here's Super Mario. What's the epistemological lesson that we can learn from Super Mario? You gotta reach for the questions. That's how you grow, and that's how you get cool superpowers. Imagine Super Mario without the questions. No falsifiability, no conversations with Socrates. He just stays small. One little Goomba can take him out. One of the reasons psychology as a discipline is rather obsessed with scientific method and showing how it is a scientific academic discipline is because whenever we try to lay out what effective thinking is, we find ourselves mostly just repeating the scientific method. The best thinking is the scientific method scaled down to the individual. So science helps humanity and culture test its ideas, move beyond them, increase its capacity to feed people, save people, travel through space. But scientific principles don't just help cultures and civilizations keep up with the needs of a growing populace. They also help any given individual in that culture or civilization keep up with the growing needs or demands that existing in said more complex situation entails. That is, the principles that helped civilization grow can help you grow as well. So why do we want our models of the universe to be falsifiable? Because we want to keep learning. We don't just want to feel correct, we want to actually be correct. And this is not for the purpose of academic philosophy so that we can think the eternal thinks. This is because being correct confers certain moral and material advantages. Whether it's not living in anxiety, whether it's freedom to help yourself grow, help other people grow. Because if it was just about sitting in an armchair and thinking the eternal thinks, if it was just knowledge for knowledge's sake, well, we could get the subjective benefit of knowledge for knowledge's sake by simply being ignorant of things and then refusing to learn from our ignorance. And if this is what we want, then we need to guard against the fact that we may be in the world where we're wrong. So we should prepare ourselves to be capable of learning in that world, i.e., we should, wherever possible, cultivate falsifiable beliefs and models of the world. The most basic necessity for which is being specific enough that you know what could prove you wrong and what specifically would be proven wrong, what belief, perspective, approach, etc. And this is where higher education comes in. What we're supposed to do is we're supposed to teach you how to think and how to write. What specifically do you think, know, or believe? You cannot avoid this question entirely, though you can avoid it being asked of specific things. So it's specificity on top of which we can make testability, and where there's testability, you can track your results. One of the reasons it can be useful to track your results is that we forget when our beliefs, when our politics, when our own personal metaphysics change. Our memories of what we used to believe tend to change along with them, far more than we think that our beliefs change. Now, we've learned enough about memory to understand why this would happen. We don't have perfect videotaped recall of the past. It's all filtered through whatever current associative networks our neurons have now. So it makes sense that our brains would rewrite or reconstruct the past in a way that's more consistent with our current beliefs. An example of tracking how people's beliefs change and how people do not understand or do not recall how much their beliefs changed was published in 1986 by Greg Marcus. He started this in 1973 when he asked around 1,900 people for their views on certain topics. Should we guarantee living standards or let people get ahead on their own? So which do you endorse? The guaranteeing of living standards or letting people get ahead on their own? Pick which you endorse, or if you think you'd be right in the middle of those two options, then pick 4. Should we protect the rights of the accused or stop crime even at the risk of violating rights? This is the age-old question in the justice system. How do we calibrate our false positive and false negative rates in the justice system? I.e., in order to protect individuals from being falsely put into prison, how many guilty people are we okay with accidentally letting them go free? North American jurisprudence is generally on the side of protecting the rights of the accused, and any student of any history will tell you that that's probably the better side to be on, because if we're even a little okay with violating the rights of innocent individuals, oppression is probably not far behind. Should we help minority groups specifically, or let them help themselves? Should we legalize marijuana or set penalties for use higher? Now keep in mind they're asking in 1973. Attitudes were far different then. For example, this question wouldn't even exist on a survey today. Should women and men have equal roles, or is women's place in the home? And finally, do you hold liberal or conservative political views generally? These are just some examples of the questions that they were asking these individuals in 1973. When they followed up 9 years later, most of the participants had changed quite a bit in terms of their beliefs. And with these changes came considerable changes, or rather differences, between what they said in 1973 and what they recall in 1982 having said in 1973. In other words, we're asking people not just what they currently believe in 1982, but also, what did you believe in 1973? Recall, as best you can, the answer you gave us 9 years ago. So in 1973, we asked both parents and their kids, or offspring, for their beliefs. Looking at the offspring first, let's look at a question that we're likely to see lots of change on. Women and men should have equal roles versus women's place in the home. Were you very much in favor of equal roles? Then you would have said 1 or 2. Were you very much in favor of a woman's place being in the home? Then you would have said 6 or 7. Those in favor of women and men having equal roles tended to remember their stance from 9 years previously, but only 56% of them remembered precisely their stance on this issue. Not surprisingly, those who we might now see as against the zeitgeist or even against history, i.e. those who said that woman's place is in the home, were less likely to remember their 1973 belief. Only 33% of them recalled their 1973 stance correctly. Now looking at the older individuals, the parents, those in favor of equal roles, only 44% remembered their initial stance correctly, and those who endorsed women's place as being in the home, only 28% of them remembered that stance correctly. So by how much were people changing their views on this question over the course of 9 years? 22% of the sample changed their views on the liberal and conservative scale question by 3 points or more, and did not recall any change at all. So 159 participants moved 3 or more points toward the liberal side, and when asked what their prior beliefs were, said that they were always where they are now. 43 individuals moved 3 or more points toward the conservative side, and likewise did not recall ever being different than what they are now. This was similar for the older individuals as well. About 30% of the parents we talked to in 1973 moved their political beliefs by half of the scale from 1973 to 1982, but in 1982 thought that they had been in 1973 the same as they are now. In other words, a whole bunch of people quite radically changed their beliefs, but don't think that their beliefs had changed. Okay, but is this relevant to anything? It was a while ago. Maybe this stuff doesn't generalize to you specifically. Alright, let's try to find something that should be more specific to you. How about a bunch of undergraduates in a course about thinking? If their beliefs change, will they know that their beliefs have changed? One thing that seems to be the focus of lots of critical thinking types of courses, sometimes these courses are called How to Think About Weird Things, but a mainstay of the curricula for them is thinking about paranormal types of beliefs. Many of the professors see themselves as inveighing against these concepts like extrasensory perception, alien abductions, superstitions, etc. So the researchers saw this as a good chance to see whether people can adequately track their changed beliefs, whether people will realize that their beliefs have changed. So in their words, most Americans, even many with advanced educational degrees, hold paranormal, superstitious, and pseudoscientific beliefs. Indeed, neither general science knowledge nor a scientific major consistently hinders such beliefs. Limited research suggests, however, that university courses that directly and skeptically examine paranormal and pseudoscientific phenomena may reduce student beliefs in them, at least in the short term. So we have an intervention that tends to work and change people's beliefs. Let's see whether people are aware or not that their beliefs have changed. Here are the pre- and post-belief results. These are the students' beliefs in psychic powers. The solid line with the diamonds indicate the students in the skepticism or critical thinking class, whereas the dashed line with the circles is the comparable control group, i.e. students at the same institution just taking a different course. So we see that in the critical thinking course, student beliefs in psychic powers, or at least their stated beliefs in psychic powers, dropped by 21%. They went from 4, so rather neutral on the issue, to about 2.5. And what specific statements are we looking at here? Statements like some people can foresee the future, extrasensory perception is real, psychically sensing when family members are in trouble is something that people can do, some dreams predict future events. So these are the types of statements that people were endorsing less after the critical thinking course. One thing to note here is that religious beliefs didn't seem to change much. So the critical thinking / skepticism course did not change people's belief in Satan, hell, heaven, and God. But something tells me they were likely not targeting that as precisely as they were targeting things like astrology and psychics. But all of that wasn't the point. The point was whether individuals would be able to recall their prior beliefs or not. Now, just to assure you that things were done quite fairly, this is the language from the test. Please read each statement and try to recall how strongly you either believed or disbelieved it the last time you completed this questionnaire. So students are asked very specifically, what answer did you give us before? We do not want you to respond according to your current beliefs, but rather according to your beliefs before you took this course. So it's a simple recall type of question. Will students report that their beliefs changed? Because for many of them, they did. On average, especially on the psychic powers question, belief or endorsement went down markedly. What do you think? Will students report that their beliefs changed accurately? Will they report less change than actually occurred? Or will they report more change than actually occurred? As with the individuals polled in the 70s and the 80s, the difference between people's remembered prior beliefs and their current beliefs is much less than the difference between their current beliefs and their actual prior beliefs. The course had made them more skeptical, as we saw, and they recalled themselves as having been more skeptical before the course than they actually had been. Hopefully that example is a little more relevant to you than the example from the 70s. There's, of course, a term for this, illusory consistency. We see ourselves as more consistent than we actually are. This seems to have more to do with how we construct a personal narrative than actual memory or consistency biases, because in some contexts we're biased to see change across time. If we go in for treatment, whether psychological or otherwise, we tend to exaggerate our prior suffering once we reach the end of treatment, perhaps in part because we want to justify the treatment. So here our bias is to see change. But we saw illusory consistency with the students, presumably because the students were invested in the narrative of being right, and they likely see their current beliefs as being right, and recall themselves as being more close to being what they currently see as correct in the past as a result of their changed beliefs. Another example study, but of course this time we're going back again to the 70s. This was published in 1973. We took 74 high school students. They rated their attitudes towards certain opinions, including towards the issue of busing, which involved taking predominantly white students from rural school zones and busing them to schools with predominantly black students in urban areas, and taking the predominantly black students from the urban schools and busing them to predominantly white rural schools. On issues like this, we assessed these high school students' attitudes, and then some days later, we manipulated these attitudes. We used what we called an experimental confederate, i.e. a slightly older high school student, and we used this student to change the beliefs of those against busing to be in favor of busing, and to change the beliefs of those in favor of busing to be against busing. And there were only 4 neutral students, and we just removed them from the experiment. There were 31 students whose attitudes were in favor of busing. And when we presented them with arguments as to why busing should stop, 88% of these students changed to being anti-busing, changed their attitudes. The 39 who in initial assessment were against busing, 64% of these were persuaded to be for the practice of busing. Now what we came for. Do they remember their prior beliefs now that we have changed them, or at least most of them have had their beliefs changed? The pro-busing group's mean rating on the 31-point scale was 8.56. That's on average how in favor of busing the pro-busing group was. But then, of course, we changed them. We changed their attitudes using this one persuasive student who presented the argument against busing. And now we ask them, what was your initial attitude regarding busing? Keep in mind, they were all pro-busing. We managed to convince 88% of them to be anti-busing. What do they remember, on average, their attitude to be? On average, their recalled initial position was that they had scored 26 out of 31. In other words, very much against busing. These high school students are, on average, extremely wrong about what they initially believed. They do not recall correctly their initial beliefs. The beliefs that on average they thought they had was nearly identical to the anti-busing group's actual initial anti-busing average. But of course, the initially anti-busing group, we convinced 61% of them to be pro-busing. Their original actual attitudinal mean was 26. When we, after convincing them to be pro-busing, ask them, what was your prior belief? The average is 17, so not quite as dramatic. So the average distance, or error, between people's actual initial scores, or initial attitudes, and what they later recalled their attitudes to be is huge. It's nearly half the scale. It's 42% of the scale. Basically, if you want to know what people currently believe, ask them what they used to believe. And if you want to know what people used to believe, don't ask them. They apparently don't know. Some other examples of illusory consistency. A lot of these come from studies by Ross. When we get individuals to write essays that argue against the beliefs that they actually hold, we tend to see that they change their beliefs quite a bit in the direction of the essays that we had them write. Now, if you're writing a proper essay and being reflective, it's actually not too surprising that it changes your beliefs. This is one of the reasons why we write. But in these paradigms, when we ask people whose beliefs have changed to simply tell us what they recall about their beliefs before their beliefs changed, their current memories of what their past beliefs are so inaccurate that they are statistically closer to their current beliefs than they are to their prior beliefs. A quote from Ross, 1989, "The figures are so similar that it would appear that we had asked for their current attitudes rather than their initial attitudes." So, who cares? Do we really need perfect memory for our prior beliefs? Isn't illusory consistency useful to us in terms of ego defenses, and isn't it rather harmless? Well, one area where this may be of importance is memory. Quoting a study from Social Cognition in 2012, when individuals do not realize that their attitudes have changed, they falsely remember acting in ways consistent with their current attitude. In other words, your inability to recall your prior beliefs is going to mess with your memory for what you actually did back when you believed other things. Here's an example that seems obvious. Whether you currently smoke, toke, or drink is going to influence your recall of how much you did that in the past. So if you smoke now, you're probably going to be more likely to remember, or think that you remember, or report that you smoked more in the past. And these studies have observed that the farther back into the past we're getting you to remember, the more your current behavior biases or influences your estimate of your past behavior toward being more consistent with your current behavior. And the more your behavior has actually changed, where we actually have measures of your prior behavior and your current behavior, the more your current behavior, what you do now, is going to bias or make incorrect your estimate or recall of that past behavior. So this illusory consistency isn't just about beliefs and attitudes. It's also about memories for behaviors, things you actually did. So we recall ourselves erroneously, as having engaged in behaviors in the past that are more consistent with the beliefs that we currently hold. This relation actually works in the other direction as well, since we already know that we can mess with people's memories rather effectively. We were able to demonstrate that when we go in and change people's memories, even for rather trivial events, this can influence attitudinal change in the present. So this is a study by Fry, Lord, and Brady in 2012. They gave people a false memory for engaging in an action and found that it changed people's beliefs. In the initial round, we had a bunch of yes or no questions about actions, whether they'd performed these actions or not. For example, have you ever talked to a gay man? Participants said yes or no. 3 of the actions that were coded as positive and that the participants said they had not engaged in were selected, and 3 weeks later we had individuals back, and they were randomized to either write fictional accounts of 4 scenes, 3 of which were the positive actions that the participant had not performed, or if the coin came up tails, the individual would just read an article arguing in favor of gay rights. And then 3 weeks after that, participants were once again asked the yes or no questions, including the 3 that had been selected out. And this simple writing of the 4 scenes was enough to get more of the participants than in the control group to have false memories of actually having engaged in the behaviors. So of those 3 positive actions that were selected out, on average, participants were now recalling that they had completed 1.5 of those actions. So just getting participants to write the little fictional stories or scenes involving these actions was enough to give us a 50% false memory implantation rate, although the control group also had a 25 to 30% false memory rate as well. But this is all old news from the first third of the course. We know about false memory implantation and how easy it is. The question is, did these now implanted memories influence people's attitudes toward gay individuals? Yes, and we can infer that it was not simply writing the scenes involving these behaviors, such as opening the door for a gay man, but rather the actual false memory that is influencing the attitudes, because we did not see on the checklists attitudinal change between the first meeting and the second meeting where they wrote the scenes, but we did see attitudinal change between the second meeting and the third meeting. Moreover, just to make doubly sure that it is the false memories that are causing the attitudinal change, the memory errors were statistically predictive of the attitude change. In other words, the more participants incorrectly recalled engaging in positive behaviors toward gay people, the more their attitudes changed to be more positive towards them. Arguably, this is hacking the illusory consistency bias. So if you can get someone to obtain a false memory of engaging in an action, then that's likely to work towards changing their attitudes to be consistent with that action. One area in which we are embarrassingly poor performers is in recalling when we have been wrong. We can't even remember when we're different, never mind when we were so different from our current belief that we were what we would now call wrong. In other words, illusory consistency in its different flavors will prevent you from having insight into your growth, your errors, your fallibility, etc. Question: where are your thoughts coming from? Your big, impressive brain with its expert-level performance, how do you trace your conclusions backward? Well, we can look at a comparable problem by asking, where do the thoughts of Amazon and Google come from? How do they make search or product recommendations? Well, they take the input that they have regarding your behavior, your clicking, your purchasing, your adjusting your searches. It sends those inputs through an associative learning node, or 2, or 10, or 5 million. And in this hidden computational layer, it looks at your data, it looks at cases like you, it looks at other individuals who have clicked on this thing, what else they have clicked on, what other words got people who also clicked on this thing to clicking on it. So the output, or the recommendation, here stated as R, is a function of your input, what you have done, and other people's input that the hidden layer deems relevant. This Bayesian hidden layer is an untraceable bit of the process between the input that you gave to Amazon or to Google and the output that it gives you. In other words, the Bayesian computational layer is a black box, much like your brain is a black box. We can't map it backwards. We can't even map it forwards again to get the exact same result, because the hidden layer is always changing. And if you want to give it the same input again, well, you gave that input previously, and the network has already learned that you gave that information previously. So it's always changing, and it's difficult to determine how actually the output came about. Now, one observation that cognitive science has made about experts is that they have to do a lot less thinking and less exploring and data gathering to come to the correct conclusion. A more experienced doctor will likely appear to not be doing much work when she palpates certain parts of your body, feels for swollen lymph nodes. More experienced law enforcement officers will catch more suspicious activity in simulations and in the real world with shorter exposure to the relevant information needed to make the decision. Basically, with expertise, you train your body and your brain to such an extent that your system one is now doing the work that over the course of painstaking deliberate practice has become habit to you. So when your system one goes to do its copy-paste, its quick and dirty associative problem solving, it's doing so correctly and efficiently, but by virtue of being system one, untraceably. So we're presented with the same problem at the expert level that we were presented with in the rest of life, but now the system we're questioning is an impressive, well-oiled, well-developed machine. There may be special challenges, special difficulties involved in questioning or evaluating with our System 2, our System 1 expertise. But of course, if you want to increase your fail rate, you have to act. So here's a quote from a great book. "We don't ask that people poke out their eyes to prevent them from making mistaken eyewitness identifications. Instead, we demonstrate the power of perceptual mischief via optical illusions and courses in perceptual psychology. Imagine how different dialogue might be with future generations, raised on the idea that there are biological constraints on our ability to know what we know. To me, that is our only hope." That's from a book called On Being Certain. Now here's one from Catherine Schulz in her book, Being Wrong. This is one of the most defining and dangerous characteristics of certainty. It is toxic to a shift in perspective. If imagination is what enables us to conceive of and enjoy stories other than our own, and if empathy is the act of taking other people's stories seriously, certainty deadens or destroys both qualities. So, certainty is lethal to two of our most redeeming and humane qualities: imagination and empathy. Stay tuned.